Today we're going to explore some internode weaving with Francesca. Super excited to explore that. But first, I'm very curious because you're bringing a different perspective to Enspiral Europe story, which is you are a member of Enspiral, you live in Europe, but you haven't really been participating in building Enspiral Europe. So I'm curious to hear why it went this way.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Michał, nice to be here. I guess it's probably useful to understand a bit my history with Enspiral, to understand why I'm not very involved in the Enspiral Europe node, which is that basically, for me, I guess Enspiral has always been very connected to New Zealand as a country. It was like me getting quite involved really started in 2016 when I went to New Zealand for the first time, and I had sort of a phase of a few years where I spent a lot of time there and was able to really build a lot of quite deep relationships with a lot of the core people of Enspiral at the time there. And so I guess on the one hand, for me, Enspiral, and I think this is probably true about most communities people are part of, is that it's connected to a certain set of specific humans that you've built relationships with and like the field that they've created. So I guess that's one piece, the fact that like most of my ties and like the relationships I invested several years in building are really in New Zealand. There's a few people that have sort of traveled around and been in different places, but yeah, it's mostly there. And then the other piece, I guess, is that the way I actually came to Enspiral was because I was very involved in developing WeShare network for many years in Europe. And I guess somehow it feels like through the fact that WeShare has always had a lot of hubs in different places, and that even though now WeShare is significantly less active and is sort of in a bit of a shutting down phase actually, or like composting many things, as we're saying, and keeping some things, the part that is still quite alive is the relational field. And that basically through my work with WeShare, I've spent the last 10 years building a lot of relationships with many different subsets of people in Europe. They're not just in the WeShare community, but in other groups as well. That I would say like my need for being in group and building social connections in Europe geographically is like super full, or like fulfilled, or like my capacity is maxed out, I could say, in another word, in that regard. So yeah, it felt like I didn't really have the energy to say, oh, I want to invest in another group of people. That it really did feel with Enspiral Europe like a new group, even though it's building on top of the Enspiral heritage and community and all of the, like it's still Enspiral, but it's like another group. So yeah, those are I guess a few reasons. And maybe the third one is also just, of course, different life phases, because I guess I did have, especially when I got involved in Enspiral, I was in a real phase of exploring the concept of network weaving and taking on the role of, I'm going to intentionally try to connect different networks. And I was putting a lot of energy into doing just that. So I was at the edge of a lot of different groups. And then basically in the last few years, I've really been focusing a lot on developing greater than the collective that I started. And so been really like in the middle of that, and had a bit less of that capacity and focus on weaving between different groups. So yeah, I think there's also a seasonality to those types of activities. And as I'm going into a new phase now of motherhood, I am also curious if maybe that changes something also about my needs and where I'm going to put my energy.
Thank you for sharing. I feel this is really wonderful how you first are very aware of that. Like, for example, just of the fact that, hey, okay, my relationships through Enspiral are actually in New Zealand. So the fact that there's this European thing emerging doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, like I want to invest there, because already my needs in Europe are met through another network. So it's I always like this idea of not necessarily jumping on, you know, another possibility just because it exists, right? And if your basket of the relationships is already met, yeah, there's a limited energy, right? So if you're investing it into new projects and also now in a big project of motherhood, it really makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I also think that like it's one of the skills that I think all of us learn when we get involved in networks and communities, of needing to have quite clear boundaries and not overestimating how many relationships we can hold. And like, it's easy to get very pulled into the FOMO and the excitement of gathering here, gathering there, this group, that conversation. And like, I think, yeah, by having had the WeShare experience early on and seeing many people go through that process of almost like community burnout, of being so overloaded with so many opportunities and possible connections, I think it was like when Enspiral Europe happened, it was at a moment where it was very clear to me like that I need to sort of resist the FOMO and like, yeah, be clear about what I have capacity for.
Wow. I really like what you mentioned. This idea community burnout. I just made a card for it. Could you speak a little bit more to that? I mean, it seems like topic. I know it's slightly diverging from the topic of building Enspiral, but I find it's a fascinating idea, and you clearly observed this many times, and I can relate to that, right? Because once you somehow end up interacting with a new group of people, there's always this pattern of like, oh wow, so exciting, new possibilities are opening, but then of course relationships take energy and time, and okay, there's of course a benefit to it and the belonging part and nurturing, but yes, there is also a cost to it, and you can in fact burn out. And so yeah, could you share a little bit more about this process and how to manage this tension, how not to burn out but get your needs met?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, unfortunately, I've seen that the people that manage to avoid it is because they've already had experienced it before elsewhere, or that they have to go through it, which I hope that that's not the case. And I mean, maybe community burnout is not the right word. It's like possibility burnout or something, or opportunity burnout, and that happens in community way more than in other contexts, I think. And I think it has to do with like the fact that there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of excitement, right? Like people really care about what they're doing. And so I think, yeah, there's this sort of permanent state of new ideas, new possibilities, new projects, and new people coming in all the time that can just get you so like activated, wanting to jump onto that it leads to exhaustion on the whole. And so I think, yeah, I don't know what ways there are other than going through it to sort of realize like, hey, there's this constant flow, and almost seeing it like as this beautiful, abundant resource. It's like a river that's always flowing, but just because it's flowing doesn't mean I have to be trying to drink all the water all the time. But that like when I have energy and it's the right moment, then I tap into it. And then I go back and like go lay by the side on the grass and recuperate, or build my hut, or whatever that is that I want to do. But so yeah, I think it's like, for me, it really feels like appreciating that that's there, but not seeing it as something that's demanding my attention or my action all the time. Because otherwise, it reminds me a little bit actually of, I think it's the baby boomer generation that had a bit the reaction to social media, like to Facebook feed posts. Like every time someone posts in the feed, they think that they need to respond to it, versus, later generations or people that are more used to it, they know, oh no, like you don't respond just because it's a post in the feed. It's not a direct message, right? So it's a bit the equivalent of that.
I really like this framing, this metaphor that that just the fact that there's this beautiful river always flowing, you don't need to just stay there with your mouth open and just drink and drink and drink, because that you're gonna explode. It doesn't lead anywhere. But it's always there if you want to tap into it. It's amazing to actually know that it's there, and it's a really beautiful state. So I'm curious from your perspective, since you're, let's say, just observing the river of Enspiral Europe, how did it look like this little stream when it started, to kind of slowly divert? Because I assume like you kind of observe it from a little bit of a distance and occasionally dropping your expertise on Lumio when we're kind of building some ideas. But how did this process felt like for you?
I mean, it felt pretty organic. Like I think it's a very typical, and I think a well-proven method, let's say, for spreading something, is that you have people that are like at the core of something in one place, and then they go to another one, and they understand the culture, they embody it, right? and then it's easy for them to seed a new version of that. I do think that also like it was always very clear that it was trying to like find new synergies and to go. I remember Rich specifically saying, or having this realization of, oh, maybe it's not the best thing to start a new community from scratch because I have these needs around community in Europe, but like, hey, we already did all this great stuff with Enspiral. Let's build on top of what we already have, which I think is really important and great. Like that's something that I always thought was really, valuable that that's happening, because I think more often than not, people have the reflex of always starting from scratch. And I guess I think what's also really interesting is that it's been a real a challenge for Enspiral. That's not quite the right word, but sort of like because Enspiral Europe has formed and been solidifying, it's been raising a lot of questions to the rest of Enspiral that I think are needed to be asked or clarified, right? And so it's sort of like, a new sibling that's starting to grow up and like is asking for clarity. Things like, what about this? What about that? And so, shaking things up a bit, let's say, or forcing a bit more maybe clarity to come out. So I definitely think that like it's been a healthy process for Enspiral to have happened. Like I think there's a real benefit to the whole network that is actually coming from Enspiral Europe, like trying to get all that clarity and building a prototype for this whole node idea.
Yeah, because it was really funny when I was first diving through all this Lumio posts, and back in 2020, this kind of one of the first posts, it already sort of predicts what's gonna happen, and it's almost phrased like, oh, for now we don't expect things will change, but with time, we might redesign Enspiral because there might be this locally rooted node thing appearing, which was still, before this actually happened. And yeah, this last September, I think we actually changed how Enspiral operates, and now nodes are a thing, and we removed this contributor member divide. So it seemed like, it actually created quite a push for innovation somehow. And I really like what you shared, this idea of, hey, this new thing growing actually forces clarity, because suddenly some things are, just we're experimenting, but what is the container within which we can experiment, and what is off limits, let's say, for our group, which is I guess maybe a point of tension possibly as well, right? To like discover what are those
Definitely.
boundaries.
Well, I think also that like, the recent sleepiness of Enspiral as a whole becomes much more obvious when you have a specific subgroup that is super active, or like spinning at a much faster level, right? And then suddenly you're like, oh, the difference is very large. Like, why is that difference so big? Like, what do we make of that, right? So yeah, I think that can be a bit uncomfortable to confront that. And I mean, I do think that there's a part of me that really feels like the jury is still out on the core of Enspiral. Like, what is going to happen with that? Or are we seeing more of a basically like seeding out these nodes, and then maybe actually it just becomes more of a distributed network? Or like, I'm not exactly sure what that sort of core essence in the middle, like what is going to happen with that. And I mean, that's also related to a lot of the questions that I think I was trying to raise back in the day in that Lumio, or it's a bit connected to that. But yeah, it feels like the level of like life energy that Enspiral Europe has is like way higher than most other parts of Enspiral. I think like Melbourne is quite active as well. But yeah, it definitely feels like a stark contrast, and I'm not quite sure what that means. Like, is there a part that's dying and a part that's basically the new, right? Or is there really still like a coexistence in a way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I had this experience really firsthand, because for me, I came through Enspiral Europe, and in this kind of early excitement discovery phase of the network, I really had this, like exactly what you named, like, oh wow, in Enspiral Europe we have this bi-weekly calls, and there's things, and even in the Slack channel you see there's like so much more activity. And then this other part, the New Zealand part, because I didn't have the relationships through gatherings and actually being there in New Zealand physically on the ground, yeah, it felt like this like distant side of things. So it's almost like Enspiral for me was kind of the opposite that for you, right? For me, it was the Enspiral Europe, which is interesting to have all those different paths of entry as well into the
Yeah,
network.
definitely.
I'm curious, one thing you mentioned is this kind of the question of coherence and like, yeah, like how Enspiral can remain Enspiral, like even if it's a new transformed iteration, while there's now this permission for new nodes to be popping up elsewhere. Because yeah, they're still Enspiral, but they're still different. They have a certain amount of autonomy. Um, how to maintain coherence? What are the challenges around this decentralized node popping everywhere?
Yeah. I mean, that's basically like the big question. And I definitely think that there's no clear answer at all. It's sort of like the ongoing question that you keep asking. But I guess to sort of maybe recap what I remember were some of the concerns, or it wasn't even the concerns, it was like the things to look out for that I shared a few years ago when this all started that really come from the WeShare experience. I think basically what's really, really challenging, I find, and it doesn't have to happen, but that when you have different nodes or different subgroups that basically start forming, and especially I think when they follow geographic lines, maybe it's even worse with countries because countries have identities as well. And that there's like, we suddenly inherit like all this crap about like, dynamics between countries and how they relate to each other. Very, very odd. But yeah, basically, I think it's just there's sort of this like natural process that starts happening, which is that the autonomy increases more and more of those individual nodes, which is generally like in the values of what we usually would want to set up, right? Because you don't want to have like this centralized thing in the middle that's coordinating everything or that's having like really strict rules as to how it has to work, right? But if you don't have that, I guess what somehow seems to often happen is that people start forming stronger identities around their subgroup and they start seeing themselves as separate from the whole.
Mm.
And I think that doesn't always happen, but like that is the thing that really scares me, like even in greater than, like it's like a fear that I've projected into seeing, even though it's like a very small scale and not happening. But that like not that people don't connect with Enspiral New Zealand anymore, but that they forget about Enspiral, the bigger project, and somehow they see, oh, well, me, Enspiral Europe, we have, our money coming in through Open Collective and we're managing that, we're doing this in a certain way, and that somehow that I am just as much part of this whole big thing and I'm taking care of that whole thing, that somehow mentally, suddenly the separation starts happening. And to me, that's like the mental model that then leads to a bunch of other challenges, basically, because it can lead to, comparison between the different groups. There being suddenly this group that might be the global group, even though that doesn't actually exist, that no one sort of identifies with, right? That there's sort of then being tensions maybe because there's difference between them, right? In terms of, how engaged some are, maybe how much is being contributed, right? Like if a lot of new stuff is being produced in Enspiral Europe, it's like, well, what are the people in New Zealand doing? Like, what the hell, right? Then maybe we're going to be frustrated about that, or I'm just making this up, of course. And then I think what also can happen, and this is maybe more like just a technicality thing, and it depends also on the locations, but that then usually that level of autonomy and like forming of identity, belonging around your specific node leads to more administrative things getting anchored around that. And I think, Open Collective is a blessing. It really is, because I think that actually, like if WeShare would have had Open Collective 10 years ago, I think things would have gone really differently. But basically in Europe, you need an entity to do stuff. Like it's not like in New Zealand somehow it's a lot easier for many people to set up their own little mini businesses. But in Europe, you need to share entities, right? And so basically what can often happen is that somehow people project the separation onto having separate legal entities, separate administrative processes. I don't know, getting their tax exempt status, or they start getting attached to those specific things. And then that leads to like a duplication of a lot of infrastructure that maybe you could actually be sharing, right? So like for now, we're all using one Slack, great. But who knows, maybe at some point someone has an idea and says, oh my God, we want to use our own Slack for some reason. And then there you go, like that's gonna start creating more and more sort of silos. But yeah, in any case, the thing that happened in WeShare specifically is that somehow it led to this real inflation of there being way too many structures and administrative overhead in proportion to the level of activity, also because in these kind of networks it changes a lot, right? And so then that creates all this dead weight, and it sort of becomes a self-perpetuating loop of like, well, we have the Spanish entity and the French entity, and who's contributing how much to which pot, and like that's when you start getting into like a lot of complexity that then like really isn't fun to manage, and like that's not really what we're here for. So something about the lightness of it disappears. This maybe doesn't, it sort of indirectly relates to the question of coherence, but I think it's basically like when people start feeling more disconnected from the whole, then that coherence of the whole goes down. People start putting more energy into their local node, which then sort of reinforces them getting anchored as separate things, and more of that energy going into maintaining that rather than maintaining the connections of the whole thing. And it sort of starts taking away some of your agility to adapt and change. And, you know, maybe nodes suddenly aren't geographic anymore. They're thematic, or I don't know, like being able to just sort of, yeah, evolve and shift more with what's happening in the network and what's alive in that regard.
I see what you mean. And I see this self-perpetuating loop, right? Like once you create your local context, it's natural that you start investing more in that context. Absolutely. Just because that's where your life is. But that also means that the local context kind of infrastructure is being built and eventually might want to be separated from the global one. But then it's actually the fact that we are sharing infrastructure is what allows this lightness and agility and kind of flow over time, and accepting that, you know, things kind of go up and down also in terms of the amounts of members and just the changes that happen. And you might end up with like lots of dead weight of locally rooted nodes that's, yeah, just like build this context, but then it just becomes too complex to manage essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's really like, it's sort of a natural process, a bit like gravity that I've just seen happen. It's not anyone's bad intention, or it's just the sort of logical steps that might happen. And so I sort of feel like it's good to really watch out for that and to sort of steer actively in the opposite direction to try to hold the balance. And also though, to just ask the question of also like, what is the core of the Enspiral project, right? Because in some cases, maybe really empowering local nodes is the thing that you want, and you want to be more rooted in that way. But it depends what the purpose really is of the whole. And I guess, yeah, that always goes back to this question of like, who is thinking about that coherence of the whole? Who really feels connected to that? Because I guess what's interesting, what happened in WeShare really, is that over time, these different groups, they developed more and more of their own identities, their own versions. And at some point it was like, are we still the same WeShare? Like, it feels like completely different WeShares in different places. And then if they're using a shared brand, you know, there's sort of, what is the level of tolerance that is okay for it to be different? And for that, if I arrive in the organization, that I have a completely different experience if I arrive in Spain than if I arrive in France or in New Zealand or wherever. So I think that's, you know, sort of like the extreme opposite of the corporate streamlined franchise experience, right? Of like, it's the same everywhere. Like, that's not what we want. But what is that minimum viable coherence that really is needed?
So switching gears slightly, like given your experience in WeShare and kind of what would you do differently, or like what is the kind of lessons or kind of some principles or ideas that could help prevent this separation and unnecessary complexifying in Enspiral as new nodes start to appear? And of course, we're just experimenting, right? We have one node that just appeared, and then another one that is forming, and then some ideas for the next one. So I guess it's not going to be that within next year we're going to have 20 nodes. So we still have time, and we can actively design for this, right? For steering back towards coherence. But what could help with that? Like, what kind of practices or frameworks or any other ideas or lessons you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult because Enspiral really is in a very specific moment right now. Referring to what I was saying before about certain things are sort of dying or slowing down, and other things are getting rejuvenated. And it really mirrors where WeShare is right now, right? Just in the case of WeShare, actually almost everything's being composted. Not everything, but a lot. And in Spiral, it feels like there's some buds that are clearly there that are like some new trees, right? But basically, I think, to me, it's quite simple, or the simplest thing that you can do is just make it a priority to invest in building relationships with people in the other places. And like that just being like a non-negotiable. Because this is definitely something that we had often seen in WeShare of like people in France say, oh, well, we don't know anyone in other places. We don't have time, or we don't feel like investing in building those relationships. Same for people in Spain and Germany and different places. And that like there's many reasons you can understand that, and it shouldn't be mandatory for everyone, but something about the ratio of how many people need to be building those connections seems important. And the coherence you'll then get through those relationships, I think. So like even if it was just, I don't know, once a year, at least a few people from each node need to come together and meet in person and talk about this common project. And that really needs to be something that is, seen as essential and like resourced, right? It can't just be, oh, the few people that really care, they do it, and then everyone else just sort of lets them, like that it's sort of being outsourced, right? Like how to make that understanding of we're part of one bigger whole really integral.
I find it fascinating that in all of the conversations I have, it always ends up coming back, prioritize relationships. It's just so amazing to hear
That's
that
funny.
over and over again. And it really does make sense. And it's almost, it seems almost effortless, right? Like once you have this inter-node relationships happening, and like, let's say people just travel once a year or however often, and actually meet in person, this coherence just kind of happens naturally. It's not necessarily that you need to, have activities that build coherence. It's just coherence is formed through the relationships as the relationships grow.
Yeah, and I mean, in WeShare, we had these international summits twice a year at the beginning for several years. And at that time, it was really working well. The coherence was quite high, and there were quite a few more people that were investing in building those relationships and doing the cross-connecting. And there was a lot of events, like there was a lot of occasions for people to meet. And that sort of decreased over time. And the more activity there was locally, people just went to their local ones because they didn't have to go to the global stuff as well. There was already enough going on locally, right? So yeah, I definitely think coherence is something, it happens naturally when people have enough touch points.
Okay, yeah, so I hear a big tip or kind of steering towards that, the internode relationship building.
And yeah, I think the only other thing though, because to connect with the sort of specific moment that I think Enspiral is at, is that it does feel quite different from also when I first made that post, that like I'm not sure how much of a sense there is of what Enspiral is now, or what is it going to be in the next 10 years. And I think that if there's a lot of energy from Enspiral Europe or one or two other nodes, that like they should somehow get the freedom to run with it and figure out what it should be in its next form, maybe. So that sort of goes a bit in the opposite direction of the coherence, right? But like, it doesn't make sense to try to cohere with something that's in a completely different stage, that's actually sort of like slowing down and just going to be like a container for a bunch of relationships that will continue. And so I think, it's just important to be aware of what are you trying to connect with, because you wouldn't want Enspiral Europe to just get sort of slowed down or moved into that sort of energy maybe that Enspiral New Zealand has, because it's just at a different stage.
I find that this weaves beautifully with where we kind of started this conversation, that just almost by this fact of the nodes sort of pushing away from the center and finding their own kind of identities, they bring questions that then help shape the coherence of the whole thing, rather than just kind of copy paste coherence from the global into this franchise model where it's all the same, just like it's based in this city or this country.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
I think that's a very good way to describe it.
Wow, this is super useful. I guess I have one more question, which is kind of slightly different, but also in this area of building new things within the existing network. Like, what would be your guidance or advice or things you've noticed for helping the core team of builders to prevent them from burning out, as you know, they drive this initial energy? And I guess somehow it can be maybe even more complex when you have an existing kind of backpack of legacy, that hey, you're not building this new thing that you can just experiment freely and do whatever you want, essentially, but you have, you know, still there's this brand, and then there's Enspiral, and you need to kind of negotiate the boundaries. So it's almost like, you know, it's a benefit, right? Because you already have some tools and principles and relationships, but it's also a limiting factor maybe to an extent. So I wonder, yeah, how this relates with preventing the burnout of the source builders, and you know, help to transfer knowledge and yeah, activity.
Yeah, it's definitely a big challenge. I mean, I think that it seems really, really important that that core builder team, I think that they're super aware of what energy are they giving from. So like they're giving to the network by building it, or they're putting in this energy of constructing something, right? And like what part of them is doing that? Why? Like what is the driver behind it? And that if it's a sacrificial, I'm doing it for the community, for others, to immediately stop. Or like that's usually not a very regenerative place to be coming from. And that basically in that same vein, like connected to the motivation, like what is resourcing that work, to just be really, really clear about that, whether it's paid or it's not paid. And if it's not paid, maybe it's subsidized through some other things, or there's actual tangible value that you are getting, but that you're explicit about that with yourself and to the other people that see those people putting in all that time. I really think like, yeah, just being super clear with oneself about that and explicit in terms of that value flow and like, why am I building this? That is really, really important. And I think that, for instance, and maybe I, you know, have this wrong, but like one can see with Rich, for instance, the energy that I see him building this from, he's thought about, probably because of the past experiences that we've all had, right? It's like, how can this provide synergies with my work on microsolidarity? This is the great experiment. I have the hum. I'm selling certain services, right? So like, I can see from a value flow perspective that it's not too extractive to himself to be doing this, at least much less than I've seen many other people doing over the years in different groups. I'm not saying that it's perfect, because obviously I don't know the details, but I think that kind of thinking is really essential.
This
So yeah, I
feels
don't know if
like
that answers your question.
I feel it's like an amazing golden nugget, and I also have experience of witnessing this in many different groups. Like, just, you know, people care, so they give a lot of energy, but it's not regenerative because it's more sacrifice for the, you know, working for purpose or for the well-being of others, which is beautiful motivation. And it's great that it's there, but maybe it also needs to be built on some kind of foundation of other value flow, and just being aware, okay, where is the energy coming in from? If it's coming out, there needs to be balance, otherwise it's just not gonna last for a very long time.
Exactly. Yeah, not expecting passion to just endlessly replenish you alone, right?
Very grounding, but very true. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's a beautiful place to end this. I don't know if there's anything else on your mind that you'd like to add or share before we close.
No, I'm just very grateful that you're having these conversations because I think, yeah, this is a great way to help build coherence and start conversations and capture knowledge, which I'm always very passionate about. And I'm quite happy to see that, like, you know, these old Lumio threads where people wrote stuff. I remember when I wrote all of that, it was like, should I take the time to do this? I felt like I have to share some of my insights because I had already seen something so similar happen, and just never quite knowing if it's ever going to get read or be useful. And so I'm just happy to see these threads circle back and yeah, provide context for interesting conversations.
Super happy. I'm really glad you wrote this post. I think it's always a tremendous value of sharing this kind of information, and also learning who in the network knows about which parts. And yeah, it was super cool to read that post, and it led me to this conversation with you. So thank you for this opportunity.